Welcome back. We're moving right along. We have finished chapter 6 and we're moving into chapter 7. This is all part of module 2. Now we're going to start talking about the skeletal system, and I do want to make note that typically in our classroom I'm capable of bringing in an actual skeleton. If you have any availability to either a model or a additional online resource that helps you look in a 3D way to the skeleton, I strongly recommend it. Your coloring book with the CD that comes with the text is pretty good about identifying or helping you to identify, learn how to spell the different bones of the body. But you will need to spend quite a bit of time being able to come up with a way to sequence and remember the major bones of the body. In the Blackboard site, there is a list of those bones that you need to know. It also includes how many of each of those bones you will need to know. In other words, for example, you have one sternum, but you have 12 ribs, so you'll need to know which number of those particular kinds of bones you have besides the names of the bones, the locations, and how to spell them correctly. So if you are on campus, our Health Learning Lab does have the skeleton available to the student to be able to review, and I strongly recommend that if you have other courses that are on site. Well, let's talk about the skeletal system. And when we look at the bones of the body, we look at the different shapes that they come. And there are long bones, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, sesamoid or round bones. And here are some of the locations of those particular types of bones. And we're going to also talk about some of the details of the anatomy of a long bone. Now, long bones are found in much of the appendicular portion of your skeleton. As you can see, this is a femur that's kind of highlighted in that pictorial. B are the short bones, and we find those in our wrists and our ankles. They are obviously not as long as the long ones, and they are sometimes also a little bit irregular, but they are short. Flat bones are things, again, like your sternum or different ones of the cranial plates. So that's letter C. Irregular bones are like the vertebral bodies, and if you look at the vertebrae of your spine, those are pretty dang irregular. They're almost peculiar shaped, if nothing else. Sesamoid bones include the round bones of the patella or the kneecap. Now we're going to look at the different parts of the long bones, and probably the most important thing to first learn is the fact that the ends of the long bones are called the epiphyses or the epiphysis. You have a proximal, and when we say proximal, we're referring to that which is closest to the core of the body. And then we have distal. So you have the proximal and distal epiphysis, and between those two ends is the long shaft of the bone, also known as the diaphysis. So you have the epiphysis and the diaphysis. And if you notice in here, we have this little fine line here, and not shown here, but there's also ones here, are the epiphyseal plates. This is the location where, as you're growing as a young child, you have mitotically dividing cells that then push length of bone to dictate eventually how tall and long you will be. We have compact bone and we have spongy bone. Spongy bone is where we find marrow. Compact bone includes what you and I perceive as the hard part of the bone, such as that which we find in the periosteum, which is the outer layer of the bone. At the end of our bones, not shown very well here, but somewhat well here, is articulating cartilage. If you've ever eaten a chicken bone and you take the meaty part off the ends of the bone, there's a very smooth, hard surface, and that is an articulating cartilage. And when we say articulating, we're saying the bones where they meet end to end. And that cartilage is hard packed, smooth, so that we decrease friction at those joints. We have the periosteum of the bone, which is the outer portion, outer covering. And then we have the endosteum, which is this inner layer of this particular cavity called the medullary cavity. And it's in this cavity that we find the nerves and the blood supply and a fatty substance found in the yellow marrow. The trabeculae are these small, I always think of them as lace-like, but the small portions of the spongy bone that when put together allow for the lace-like appearance of that spongy bone. And it's within that spongy bone that we do indeed find the marrow. And we're going to talk a lot about bone marrow and the fact that hematopoiesis, or the production of new blood supportive cells, occurs at the marrow of the bone. Now, bone forms by, again, making new cells. One of the theories behind bone formation, if you look in your text on figure 7-6, they show you endochondral ossification. We believe that many of the bones start as cartilage, and as they progress in their development become what we perceive as the hardened structure of our adult skeleton. Some of the bones might even start as membranes, like those that we find over the cranium for the cranial plates. Growth of bone for length occurs at the epiphysis. Growth of bone for circumference of the bone occurs at the level of the diaphysis. A term you need to become familiar with is osteocyte. Cyte means cell, and osteo is bone, so this is bone cells. Some of the environmental factors that provide us adequate bone growth include certain kinds of inorganic salts, minerals, and vitamins. To have strong bones, you've probably heard about this forever and, commercials and whatnot, but you have to have calcium. Calcium is stored in the bones, and it's also part of the structure of the bones. You also need to make new bone cells, vitamin A, C, and to absorb the calcium, vitamin D. The epiphyseal plate and the length of bone is influenced by something produced in the pituitary called growth hormone. Without growth hormone, or in excess of growth hormone, you'll either be too short or way too tall. I'm sure that our group that presents the pituitary and talks about growth hormone hopefully will talk about dwarfism and giganticism, which is secondary to having too much of an influence at that epiphyseal plate and therefore making way too much length of bone or way too little. The other thing that influences the production on laying down of new bone cells includes exercise and weight-bearing exercise, in the weight-bearing form, I should say. Those people who would possibly be in space for prolonged periods of time can actually start to become osteoporotic and demineralize their bone if they don't have gravity and weight bearing. The picture that you see at the bottom here looks at the effect of maybe also not producing enough new bone cells or having enough weight bearing exercise and developing something called osteoporosis. We keep mentioning that you have to have calcium for cardiac muscle contractility and skeletal muscle contractility. To have calcium available, those of you who present parathyroid will be talking about the fact that if the serum or blood calcium level is too low, we will draw calcium indeed from the bone. And if you have too little storage, you will turn out to start to actually break down the spaces between that spongy bone and the density of your compact bone, and you become somewhat fragile, more like china compared to everyday dinnerware. As a result, you may start to see, as you can see in this pictorial, what we see in many elderly women especially, where they have a significant amount of osteoporosis and a curvature of the spine. 5 functions of this skeleton include providing us a framework, protecting those delicate structures within, having a point to have an attachment of muscle so that there's a lever to make movement. It is the storehouse for calcium and phosphorus. And as mentioned before, in the marrow, it is where we produce blood components, including the red cell, white cell, platelets, to name a few. When we look at the skeletal organization, it's actually divided into an axial and appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton includes the head, the neck, and the trunk, as you can see in the orange. And the appendicular skeleton includes the upper limbs, the lower limbs, the pectoral girdle, and the pelvic girdle. The pectoral girdle is like your shoulder. It's your shoulder girdle, they call it. Now, using your text, the online quizzes, the coloring book, supplemental online materials for bones, you are now to identify those listed and be able to know their location, name, and also eventually the joints that connect them. As you look at the human skeleton, you will need, as I mentioned, a number of different resources if you don't have an actual skeleton, since you are doing this online. If you are on campus, again, I really encourage you to come to the Health Learning Lab, check out the skeleton, try to point and identify the different bone types. You might find that during this time period that we have this particular unit, I just might email you directly a specific question about the bones. So just be kind of prepared, since I know we don't have that joint opportunity to play with the skeleton. I might do a little quizzing myself, not for grade, but just to make sure that we're on pace for knowing the skeletal names. It's important to learn the names of the skeletal bones because of the fact that many of our vessels and nerves are parallel to them and named accordingly. Okay, so from head to toe, there is a list of those bones that you're going to need to know that's in Blackboard. And you need, as I mentioned before, to know the names of the bones, the location of the bones, and hopefully those which are proximal to it. In your text also, I already mentioned in the previous slide about osteoporosis. There's two other terms that you need to be very familiar with, one of which is osteoblast, the other is osteoclast. Osteoblast are new bone forming cells. Osteoclast is the breaking down mechanism that breaks down those bone cells to release calcium to have it available for physiology of contractile forces in our body. The next section, and I'm sorry, there's also in your information section or in the module a animation about the structure, the microscopic structure of the bone, which also details the Haversian systems and the lacunae and the lamellae of the bone. So I also do want you to review that particular portion of both the text as well as the online animation. Now we're going to move into joints, and another name for a joint is an articulation. End to end, articulating. Functional junctions between bones is what we call joints or articulations. They bind parts of the skeletal system together, and without having that little tug on the bone, it also might reduce the production of new bone cells, which is hence why we mentioned exercises aids in density of bone, because it makes bone growth possible. The joints also permit parts of the skeleton to change shape during childbirth, and we know that in females. The pelvic bones, the joints between those, the symphysis pubis for one, will actually, with the influence of estrogen, soften and enable the passage of that fetal head. Joints also enable the body to move in response to skeletal muscle contraction. Now this is the structure of a diarthritic joint. There's a number of different types of joints, and in your text they also discuss this particular type. And in the next slide will mention the other types. But if you look in your text at figure 727, they also have the structure of the diarthritic joint. This is the spongy and compact bone, here and here, and this grayish white product at the ends is the articulating cartilage, and then wrapped around that joint is a joint cavity that's supported by the synovial membrane. In this entire thing is called the joint capsule. Now, the synovial fluid that's in the synovial membrane is also helpful in reducing friction at that articulation. So diarthrosis are freely movable joints if you're reading your text. They have a joint capsule, joint cavity, layer of cartilage over the ends. And the joint capsule, as mentioned in your text, is made up of the strongest and toughest material, fibrous connective tissue. And if you remember when we looked at the slides of the fibrous connective tissue, it's really densely packed. That synovial membrane produces the actual synovial fluid. Ligaments is another name that you need to become familiar with. A ligament is a cord or band, as mentioned in your text, made of the same strong fibrous connective tissue as the capsule, and it grows out of the periosteum and combine the two bones together even more firmly. So bone to bone is a ligament. Muscle to bone attachments are tendons. So bone to bone is ligament or ligamentous. Muscle to bone is tendon. The classification of joints include fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial. Fibrous joints are those types of joints you find such as between the skull plates. Dense connective tissue connect these bones and they're in very close contact. Another fibrous joint is how your tooth is actually embedded into your maxilla and mandible. Cartilaginous joints are those that have a cartilaginous plate or form such as the disc that we find in our vertebral column. There's hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage that connect bones together. Synovial joints are those that are diarthritic, as the one that we just showed you, such as found in the knee, the shoulder. They're the most complex and they allow for the freest amount of movement. Also in your text, they have a pretty good pictorial of the names and locations of hinge, pivot, saddle, condyloid, ball and socket, and gliding joints. You'll want to also look at the pictures as well as the locations in figure 728 to be familiar with those particular types of joints of the body. Now, once we think about hinge joints, we have to say to ourselves, where in our body are we hinged? Where do we allow for flexion and extension? And is that only at a hinge joint, or can we also flex and extend at a ball and socket joint? I want you to take your body and literally move it through all of these different positions. Flexion, extension, abduction, which is when you go away from the core, supination and pronation, and be very familiar with what position you are in. Are you supine or prone when you're in the anatomic position? Rotation, dorsiflexion, and plantar flexion. So as a matter of fact, if you look here, dorsiflexion is up, plantar flexion is down. Extension is extending the angle of the joint. Flexion is reducing the angle of the joint. We can extend and hyperextend certain portions of our body. Of course, we can also, based on pivot joints, have a certain rotational ability of different parts, such as in our neck. But we can't fully pivot all the way around unless you are really odd. Now, of course, also we have the Cirque du Soleil people who seem to have almost like a double joint. When we say double joint is when we're going past the expected range of motion of a joint. So do take time on figure 728 on this list. Maybe actually take a family member or a friend and move them through the different modalities of flexion, extension. Play a Simon Says, and then think about what joints are involved, and also start to think about what bones are involved are most proximal to one another in these different motions. That ends the very brief PowerPoint for the skeletal system. Most of this particular unit, you will be needing to continue to do a lot of self-study again for the names of the bones. All those from the cranium, and like for example, as you're reviewing the cranial bones, making sure that you know the different cranial plates. If you look on figure 710, they do indeed show you the frontal bone, the parietal bone, ethmoid, sphenoid, lacrimal, zygomatic, maxilla, mandible, and also some foramen. Foramen are actually holes that allow for the passage of either vessels or nerves through bony parts of our body. So if you hear the concept foramen or foramina, indeed that is referring to some form of a passageway. The other thing that you, again, I will probably be sending a little bit of kind of additional quizzing, because you do need to learn everything on the list, and for me to just spew it here is not going to help you. This is going to have to really take a lot of self-study. At the end of the semester, just to give you a heads up, I will in the final exam have a pictorial where you will have to label the bones. So I'm giving you that heads up kind of early on, so that when you go into your nursing programming or on for whatever programming you might have that this applies to, that you remember and know the names of the major bones. Okie dokie. I think that's about all we're going to say. Most of this is most ideally attended to by having a 3D image, if at all possible. You know, using one thing I used during my anatomy class way back when I took it in undergraduate is I actually got a model of the human body. It was a small little 14-inch invisible woman, and she had her entire skeleton. So I was able to hold the skeleton up and point to the different bones to be able to learn them. And I'd kind of encourage you to do something similar to that if you can afford that. And if not, again, if on campus, please come and you know, and or you could also stop by and let me know, and we can maybe spend a little bit of time with the skeleton together. So that's the end of the very brief introduction to the skeletal system. Most of this will be self-study.